Hi there, everyone. Welcome to the next edition of Conversations with Matt Lewison. One of my favourite parts of what we do is being able to share knowledge not only with our viewers but internally with our staff, and I guess share the decades of expertise that we've got with all of those that are interested in property. So today's episode, I'm sure, is going to be a cracker for you. Great to have you down in person again, Louis, face to face. The construction industry and building in particular, obviously it's a great way to build wealth, awesome way to maximise your tax benefits, best way to get maximum tenant appeal and make sure you got rental income, as well as some other benefits out there. But obviously there's a lot in the news lately around the construction industry. What are you seeing and hearing on the ground around what's happening in construction?
I mean, it's been a really interesting, I suppose, 18 months in the construction market. I think we saw obviously when Home Builder kicked in around, was it August 2020, and it had a huge impact in terms of the volume of building contracts being signed. In fact, a lot of them were signed on jobs that the land wasn't ready yet. So obviously there was a bit of a backlog that created, and it led to an increase in demand for certain skills and supplies. At the same time that almost every country in the world was stimulating construction through infrastructure or housing. And we talked about it in Investing in the New Normal, which was released prior to that, saying that the thing that governments do when you're coming through a crisis is they invest to try and grow the economy. And they obviously want to grow the economy to help to cover some of their interest servicing and all that sort of stuff. But the first place they invest is in housing, typically in construction. It's a huge industry from job creation, but also they're jobs where people who earn the money invest that back into the economy really quickly, as opposed to often some of the really big jobs like mining even, money leaves the country. So we've seen this huge wave of investment in housing and infrastructure. There's bottlenecks in supply that were leading to obviously price increases, and we saw that really ramping up through 2021. In fact, it hadn't even hit the CPI figures until the last couple of months. We've started to see CPI rising, but certainly dealing with the builders over the last year and a half, we've seen that escalation in contract pricing for building a new house. Now, what we're hearing and what we're seeing is that a lot of those supply constraints are easing. If we look globally, the price of timber in the US or lumber has dropped by about 50%. Since its peak late last year. Obviously the price of oil has come back about 20% from its peak, and keep in mind some of these supply constraints were also caused by the war in Ukraine that started earlier this year, obviously impacting oil and food, lockdowns in China through most of last year and earlier this year, and they're starting to hopefully ease. We've had rat plagues in Australia last year, we've had floods, we've had pretty much everything.
The perfect storm.
Fires, floods, famine. So we've seen all those things impacting supply. And while they're starting to now wash out of the system, now we're seeing the constraint being the labour market. So we've got 500,000 unfilled jobs in Australia right now. In fact, there's more job vacancies than unemployed persons. And keep in mind, there's a lot of unemployed persons who probably either don't want a job or are unemployable for the jobs that their vacancies are for right now, because they lack the required skills, training, and capabilities. So that's kind of where a lot of the focus now from builders is shifting to that labour market supply. And I mean, I think the only way to see that resolving in the near term is for immigration to really ramp up. And I guess the positive news on that is that we also saw in June, which were the most recent figures, a record number of visa applications approved by the Australian government. A lot of those being for students, and obviously they do make their way into the hospitality industry, not necessarily the construction industry where the highest number of jobs are, or job vacancies are. I think it's construction managers first and civil engineers second. So that's going to take more of a concerted effort to bring them in. And obviously we've got a job summit coming up in the next week or so. And I guess one of the interesting things I saw was some of the really big employers that are obviously desperate to bring resources into the country and fill some of their job vacancies. are telling the government that it takes up to a year to bring somebody into the market, into Australia and fill a job right now, from the day that the vacancy starts to the day they bring somebody in from overseas and get that job filled, because they have to go through a big process of advertising locally, then obviously advertising overseas and going through kind of all the visa applications before somebody turns up and they're standing there ready to work. So I think it's not something that's going to be fixed overnight, but certainly over the next year, I think that increase in immigration, which is undoubtedly going to happen, is going to, I guess, eventually address that situation.
You've shared heaps there. I've got a bunch of questions on. I'm trying to think back to what you said 10 minutes ago, but I think it's really important. I mean, we've known each other a long time, right? When I talk to clients and investors, I really try to focus on the simplicity and the forces that drive things up, right? So basics are being supply and demand. And the reason why housing has been and will continue to be one of the first things that governments stimulate is because the construction industry is the second largest job vertical in Australia. Retail is the largest in terms of job numbers. And anytime you buy a house, you've got to spend a whole bunch of money in retail for appliances and beds and cupboards and clothes and all the rest of it, right? So it's an obvious place to get a quick kind of bang for your buck, so to speak. And the other thing that you mentioned was around jobs. So the Labor government have got the job summit next week, and data's just come out around the 10 most in-demand jobs in the near future. You mentioned construction managers, number 1, civil engineers, number 2, registered nurses were number 3, and aged care support workers were number 10 on that list. So obviously the construction side of things talks to, and we talk a lot about kind of government's vested interest, right? So government's vested interest in a strong and stable economy. We can learn a lot, I think, around these this job summit and the target jobs, because it tells us where the government want to take the country, right? And you don't have a high demand for construction managers and civil engineers if you're not building infrastructure. You're not building infrastructure unless you've got more people and population growth. So if we bring it back to investors, more population growth coupled with the challenges that we've seen, meaning less supply of housing, is why we're so bullish about what's going to be happening in the near future with the housing market. But I wanted to get your take specifically around, I guess, nursing and aged care, because that's something that we've talked a lot about for a long period of time. Nearly 20 years ago, actually, 2005, 2006 was when that kind of concept started to come through. So maybe you could share that with people.
Yeah, I think Michael and I both read a book called Why We Want You to Be Rich, written by Robert Kiyosaki, author of Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and Donald Trump. Let's not talk about him too much. Well before his presidential tilt. But it was kind of one of the things that really woke me up as well to the looming crisis. And the premise of that book was to talk about the rising debt in the US and the obligation that the US government had to the future retirees, pensioners, obviously looking at the demographics and the number of baby boomers that were going to be eventually leaving the workforce. And that was, as I said, a huge wake-up call for me, because the same thing is true in Australia. Yes, there are a number of people, yes, we have superannuation, might be better than the 501k in the US. It's been a really well-established program, the superannuation program in Australia. But most people, the majority of people, don't have sufficient super to be able to cater for their retirement, particularly in an inflationary environment as well. As prices go up, then it diminishes the cash balance, or what you can buy with the cash balance for a retiree. It's one of the reasons why central banks are so nervous about inflation as well. But we're obviously in a situation where we're now seeing baby boomers leaving the workforce in faster and faster numbers. And as they're leaving the workforce, they're not being replaced at the same rate. And because we're obviously therefore seeing a diminishing number of people who are skilled and capable in certain roles, that's obviously putting more pressure on those roles. And the only way to overcome that is through immigration. But also it really talks to the fact of why it's so important. And again, it was a big motivator for me through my 20s to really get on top of my investing and make sure that I was using those formative years in my career to build a great base of investment, knowing that I never want to rely on the government for the pension and for my medical needs in the future, because there's a chance that obviously with this growing need, and they won't be able to cover it. I think the stats in America, and this is going back 10 years, I think in the GFC, when they obviously were looking at increasing the peak debt that the US government was allowed to have, and it was going through the Senate. I think it was around 14 trillion. And about a third of that was the government's debt to pensioners. Basically, that was their allowance to cover the pension for the people who had already qualified for the pension, and it was the biggest component of their debt. And that was 14 years ago. And again, it's going to continue to grow as more and more pensioners start to rely on that government funding, as well as the hospitals. I mean, the Victorian opposition party, the Liberal Party, have already started running a campaign for the upcoming election, saying that if they get into power, they'll scrap the $50 billion that's been set aside to cover the rail loop around Melbourne, in favour of investing that in hospitals because of the need for more hospital beds and more aged care facilities. So obviously that kind of really shows how much urgency the government or different governments are putting around these things, and it's something we've underinvested in. So there's going to be more and more investment there, and as I said, we're going to see more and more people coming out of that workforce, and unless we can have babies that come in at 24 years old with a degree already, the only way to put people in those jobs is to bring them in from overseas. And coming back to obviously the fact that construction jobs are one of the highest, and in fact number one, in that skills demand, it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy as well, isn't it? Because when you have a job need for, let's call it 500,000 people, if you bring in 500,000 people to fill those jobs, you're actually going to create more demand for more jobs, because those 500,000 people go and spend money in the economy. They're also going to need somewhere to live, and we've got a rental crisis right now with the shortage of housing. So they're going to be obviously putting demand on new housing, which is going to mean that more needs to be built, which is going to put more demand on those staff where we've already got shortages. So the 500,000, if we actually bring them in the next year or two, is going to obviously lead to more demand. So it gave me that great sense of confidence that if I'm investing in property, there's always going to be demand for that property, and that the system is set up to support growth in property prices, because nobody's going to invest in an asset that doesn't go up in value. The government knows that, and the government needs to ensure that there's constant and regular growth in prices as well as rental income. The whole system supports property investment because it's in the government's interest for us to invest in property and provide more houses for future people to live in. So,
yeah. Sounds like growth on top of growth on top of growth, which is compound growth. And fundamentally, it's a pretty simple thing, right? Like with the first home buyer support policy that the Labor government had, where they're willing to invest 40% in someone's first house. Don't think they'd be investing 40% in something that they thought was going to go down in value. So there you have it, investors. Some great insights, as always, from OpenCorp CEO Matt Lewison. I'm Michael Beresford. Been great being with you. Keep your investing simple, understand supply and demand, and it's a pretty good recipe for seeing success over the long term. We'll see you in our next episode.
spot on.